Hey, hello, are we ready for March anticipated reads? I don't know if I am, to be completely honest, because I have around 29 titles to touch on today, and I recognize that I have done this to myself, but we'll see how this goes. The good news is this is our first monthly anticipated for like, what, 3 months that we haven't had to worry about the HarperCollins strike, so we will be getting those titles back into the rotation across the channel, hopefully. So to jump right into it, starting March 7th, we have Wayward by Amelia Hart. This seems to be an intergenerational tale with potential touches of magic, following a young woman fleeing an abusive relationship and going to this remote cottage that she has inherited from an eccentric aunt. And while she's trying to untangle her own trauma, she comes across a family secret involving the women in her family that dates back to an accusation of witchcraft in the 17th century. So I'm very interested in this. This is the kind of genre of intergenerational tale I'm really interested in. Reminds me in my own reading life of like the physic book of Deliverance Dane by Catherine Howe. So I'll be interested to see how it attacks the kind of witch narrative, especially in that kind of bleeding of historical fiction and potential fantasy, especially because things like this, or the sense I'm getting from it, are exploring the kind of silent power of women, or how when that power becomes less silent, it is kind of tamped down and controlled by larger societal forces, men, what have you. So I'll be interested to see how much commentary there is here, whether it's more kind of just like a family-focused saga. I don't know, but definitely have my eye on it. And then we have the start of a new series by Hannah Witten, The Foxglove King. This follows a young woman who has magic associated with death and about a decade ago escaped from a cult that lived in the catacombs. So it's giving me Paris vibes right out of the gate. We'll see if that's true. And so she has been a poison runner, presumably, according to the blurb, and then somehow she is discovered, or her association with this magic is discovered. And this discovery puts her on the radar of the king and means that she has to kind of navigate the politics of this glittering court. And courtly politics for me, especially in fantasies where there is that sense of at least one degree of removal from reality, are fun. It is that kind of what can you trust, who can you trust. Nothing is ever what it seems on the surface, and there are always levels of intrigue and kind of consideration. So she's now in this world, kind of gilded with this opulence. Another reason the blurb makes me think of France in particular for this fantasy world. And so her being kind of on the radar more here, or at court, is potentially going to blow her cover with this cult she has been on the run from for 10 years, but her magic has kind of kept her tied to this place so she can't like escape fully. So presumably she will have to reckon with that and face off against her past there. So it seems like it's going to have intrigue, magic, death, romance, the whole shebang. This admittedly feels like a familiar place, but fair enough, a place that we keep going back to. So I'm excited to see Witten's take on this, especially based on her language in the one book I've read from her. I think it will fit in that kind of in-between for people. It does tease a romance plotline, but I don't think it's going to be like full spice for people who are looking for something that's kind of in the middle of the fantasy romance and just general fantasy, while still having those tinges of danger and darkness around the world. So I'll be interested to see where this ends up landing on that spectrum and what demographic of readers it ends up appealing to most, but I definitely have my eye on it. And then The God of Endings by Jacqueline Holland, which seems like it may also be an intergenerational tale of a sorts. We'll see to what depth, but with a supernatural bend. It follows this artist who's teaching at an elite upstate New York school, but she also has been cursed or gifted, depending on how the narrative explores it, with immortality from her grandfather. So she's been kind of existing for centuries, but her stasis is kind of upset by a student at her school who comes from a troubled home, and this stalking presence, as the blurb refers to it, from her past and her own growing hunger. Again, blurb verbiage there. So I anticipate that this will be comped the most to Addie LaRue, or that it will be discussed in terms of Addie LaRue the most. And I think that that's fair based on what has been popular, but I am interested to see if this works better for me than the book Eternal Life that came out, I don't even remember how many years ago now, and I admittedly DNF'd that, and that also looked at a woman who had been around for centuries, but outside of like the traditional realm of vampires. And I was really, really excited for that book. And I was listening to it on audio on RB Digital, and it just ultimately didn't keep me engaged, and I was really bummed about it. So I eventually admitted defeat and put it aside, but I'm very excited to see if this works for me a little better, because it seems like it's going to be covering similar themes in the way things come to a head. I'm trying to get a sense of how the marketing for this has been working, because there aren't a whole lot of ratings on Goodreads right now, but I feel like I've been seeing it posted a lot, both from the publisher, especially on Instagram. I think I've seen it from some indie bookstores, so I think it is definitely going after like the indie bookstore audience. Also, now that I say that there hasn't been a whole lot of ratings on Goodreads yet, I am seeing that it has a tag for vampires, so I'll be interested to see if that actually is in play, or if that's just kind of the easiest coding for kind of explorations of immortality that we have. So definitely interested in this. Definitely think it's going to end up falling more on the literary side of things, by which I mostly mean I think it's going to be a little slower, a little more introspective and reflective, but again, haven't read it yet. And then speaking of literary, we then have Birnam Wood by Eleanor Catton. This is the author of The Luminaries, and if you have seen The Luminaries, which you probably have because it has been around for a while, it is a chunker. And it came out around the same time as The Goldfinch, so it was a time of chunkers. This one is a little over 400 pages, it looks like, so not quite as chunky. I will admit that I wasn't fully aware of a lot of the workings of The Luminaries until I read reviews after reading the book. I didn't clock the phases of the moon at the beginning of the chapters. I didn't clock that the chapters were like having themselves as we went on, so becoming shorter. I missed all that. So I was more reading it as a kind of modern 19th century novel epic thing, especially as, to my recollection, because it's been so many years, I read it when it came out, a lot of the plot threads kind of were left unresolved in many ways. And I remember being kind of unsatisfied. And I don't need everything tied up in a neat little bow, but I either need to have like some sense of resolution or something I'm left to ponder. And we might have been approaching, and keep in mind, I have not read a lot of the criticism and kind of literary criticism that has been written about this book, because it is a book that warrants literary criticism, but in real life, people will wander off and threads will be left unresolved. And so if you're following that kind of 19th century type of novel, it kind of mirrors real life in some ways. Anyway, this book seems like it's going to be nothing like that. Admittedly, the title, Birnam Wood, is what caught me initially, and I am very interested in how it's going to play out as a tie to Macbeth, because it doesn't seem like it's going to be a straight retelling. It's following like a guerrilla gardening group, and I'm not gonna lie, that almost lost me. But they end up kind of crossing paths with an eccentric billionaire, and they're both kind of existing on this land, and this billionaire has acquired this land for his like end of the world bunker. So he kind of pairs up with this group and agrees to let them work the land, or they're working the land for him. Not really sure, but the blurb kind of talks about it digging into some psychological areas and kind of being an exploration of our impulses for survival, and I'm sure class as well. I think it will also be kind of interesting to compare and contrast against the survivalists from earlier this year in terms of that kind of exploration of survival instincts and class and the whole shebang. So definitely something on my list, and we'll see, because I predict this getting a large literary push. We'll see if that comes true, I guess. And then we have The Secret Lives of Country Gentlemen by K.J. Charles. This is a Regency romance that's going to be perfect for fans of Cat Sebastian. It follows a man, Gareth, who has just recently had a disappointing end to a love affair that he doesn't have time to linger on because his father has just passed, leaving him to inherit the title. And not only does he inherit the title, but he inherits this group of cutthroats and thieves that are operating in the same geographic area. And when he goes to testify against a woman for a hanging offense, he is blackmailed by his former lover, who just also happens to be the brother of this woman, and then it follows them as they are thrown back together and just can't seem to stay away from each other. So definitely think that this is going to be a lot of fun. And then we have A Sinister Revenge by Deanna Rayburn. This is the 8th in the Veronica Speedwell series. I admittedly am still not caught up. I think I only have the 7th to catch up on before this, but don't quote me on that. This is a long-running at this point and popular kind of historical romance series, tinges of romance in the kind of slow burn, long game kind of way. If you're a fan of Bones and still haven't read this series, I think that this would be right up your alley. But I will eventually catch back up here. And then we have My Dear Henry by Kaylin Bayron. This is part of the young adult classics retelling series that has been going on for a while, where they're retelling kind of standard classics, especially classics that would be assigned in school. And these retellings are by some of the biggest names in young adult right now. And these works are being penned by BIPOC authors, so they are in conversation with the original work in really unique ways while meeting modern readers where they are. And this is the Jekyll and Hyde installment, so I am very interested in this one for sure. And it looks like it is mirroring Jekyll and Hyde, and that it is only 272 pages quoted online. That may be longer than Jekyll and Hyde, I'm not sure. It's been a while since I read that, and I read it through a free ebook, so I had no real sense of pagination. But I am excited to see this take on it, and this cover is fantastic. I oddly also think that this cover is going to appeal to Phantom of the Opera fans. However, I guess how many teenagers are still Phantom of the Opera fans? It's not zero, but it's a very select subset, I'm thinking at this point. I don't know, if you have insider knowledge on the state of the Phantom of the Opera fandom in today's youth, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just gonna keep my eye out for this book and keep it moving. And then we have Monstrillo by Gerardo Samona Cordoba. This is a horror novel. I feel like I've been lying to you guys because there are a couple horror novels on this month's list. I've had horror novels in the past, and yet I keep coming to you saying I'm not a horror reader. And I still don't consider myself one, but I'm finding myself drawn more and more to a lot of books that exist in the kind of horror bleed over or like horror light. But regardless, this follows a grieving mother who takes the lung from her 11-year-old who has passed and nurtures it, and it grows into its own thing and begins to resemble her dead child. But it is not her child, and based on the urges of this creature, she has to keep it walled inside of her decaying Mexico City home. And I say decaying, one, because the blurb does, and I presume because it is a reflection of the interior via the exterior. But according to the blurb, and I just want to read this for you because I think it's great wording, it says, "A thought-provoking meditation on grief, acceptance, and the monstrous sides of love and loyalty, Gerardo Samona Cordova blends bold imagination and evocative prose with deep emotional rigor." So it definitely is going to be an exploration of grief. It also indicates that it's going to be told across 4 acts. So I'll be very interested to see how it is kind of structured. It does seem to me, especially because it was featured in the Millions kind of first half of the year book preview, that it is going to fall on the literary side of horror, which seems to be what I'm attracted to anyway, because I think that a little bit more of that time for reflection and pondering of bigger ideas. Not that horror doesn't have big ideas regularly, because I think it is often encapsulating some of the biggest ideas, and I'm just too much of a scaredy cat to face those ideas straight on. But I think it gives me a little bit more space to kind of process. And I think that this one's going to have some unique and intriguing ideas to process, so we'll keep our eyes on this one as usual. I feel like I say, so we're gonna keep our eyes on this one a lot in these videos, but also that's what I'm gonna do, so I apologize in advance for my lack of use of a thesaurus. And yes, we are on still March 7th. This is gonna be something, isn't it? Moving on, we have A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon by Sarah Hawley. This seems like it is going to exist in the kind of in-between of our kind of trends of both cozy fantasy and these paranormal romances. So it follows a witch who is supposed to have these kind of extreme powers. She's supposed to be like one of the strongest of her generation, but she's just really happy in her bakery baking things until one day she's baking up a spell and it goes awry and she summons a demon. Now this demon has been embarrassed in the past by some soul bargains that have gone awry, so he cannot leave our witch without securing a soul bargain. Meanwhile, our witch accidentally tells her mother that they're dating, so we've got a witch that bakes, the summoning of a demon, a soul bargain, and fake dating. Really nothing can go awry here, other than, you know, the summoning of the demon in the first place. Especially as our witch, if she does enter into a soul bargain, will lose the ability to feel, including love. So I guess we'll see if love prevails, but it is classified as romance, so I think we can place some pretty strong bets there. And then moving on to March 14th, we have Solomon's Crown by Natasha Siegel. This is a historical novel set in the 12th century, and it is following King Philip of France and King Richard and their kind of complicated relationship, and it is also exploring romance as part of that complicated relationship. I don't know a whole lot about the history of either of these two rulers, but I am very excited to see what this is going to be and how this is going to be approached, especially because now I think that this story is going to be told a lot differently than it would have been even like 10 years ago. Like 10 years ago, I read a kind of complication of Edward II, but even then it was still being told, I think, through the lens of the wife of one of Edward's most famous lovers, but don't quote me on that, it's been a second. And so the relationship was still being framed with a sense of illicitness rather than kind of romantic tragedy or the tragedy of it. And so I think that this is going to place that kind of romantic tragedy more at the forefront, or the kind of real barriers in play, especially for two rulers. So as long as this carries the kind of proper emotional weight and is handled respectfully, I think that this could be something very, very intriguing. I've definitely got my eye on it. And if nothing else, it's been a while since I've read some medieval historical fiction. And I feel like I read a bunch of medieval historical fiction when I was a teenager, though that could just be nostalgic perception. Either way, I'm excited to revisit the kind of environs, but we'll see what we get here. So moving on, we've got Flower Heart by Catherine Breakwell, which is blurbed as a cottagecore fantasy, and I'm like, what does that even mean? Is that separate than cozy fantasy? To my kind of reading of the blurb, it means fantasy in the vein of Diana Wynne Jones, even though the blurb comps it to Tamora Pierce, which is never a bad thing, obviously, and Margaret Rogerson, which I think counts because I would comp Margaret Rogerson to Diana Wynne Jones. Anyway, it follows a young woman, Clara, whose magic has never been dangerous until it causes poisonous flowers to bloom from her father's chest, and she needs to break this spell. Clearly, but it's a difficult spell to break, and the only one willing to help her is her former best friend, but for a price. And in trying to get to the root of Xavier, her former best friend's distance and his secrets, she discovers a darkness in the kingdom, and of course her magic is the only thing strong enough to defeat this darkness. And I would be willing to bet that Xavier has some idea on how to overcome this darkness as well. So like aloof young man, curses, you get why my brain is making these connections, right? It's not just me. And then we have A Manual for How to Love Us by Aaron Slaughter, a collection of short stories that, according to the blurb, are connected in unpredictable ways, but that explore grief. And what really caught my eye in the blurb is where it says that it is honoring the feral in all of us. Additionally, they are clearly going to be weird and odd, which is 100% my wheelhouse. And there's also apparently a short story that deals with an MLM scheme. So like so many of my favorite things in one place. Why wouldn't I read it? Come on. And then we have The Teachers, A Year Inside America's Most Important and Vulnerable Profession by Alexandra Robbins. This, I think, is an incredibly timely and pertinent book. I come from a family of educators. My brother is an educator. I very much grew up in a school system from riding my tricycle down the hallways. So I have incredible respect for teachers and always have. And I know the amount of work and sacrifice that goes into things. And I've only heard from teachers in this after of the pandemic. Of course, it's still going on, but you know, you have the before and the after, that the kind of landscape has changed dramatically and in a way that makes their jobs very difficult. The classrooms are much different to manage. There's that loss of time in both socialization and the mastery of skill, as well as a real politicalization of education in a way that consistently undermines and undervalues teachers. And I'm so tired of seeing teachers underappreciated, knowing how vital their work is and how much work it is. Often teaching is described as a passion or a calling in a way that kind of inherently asks for free labor of teachers, because these teachers do want the best for their students, but it's not fair to them either. So I think that really kind of looking at the system where it sits right now will be very illuminating and very important to just have as a record in some form. I'm sure, unfortunately, that the people, as usual, that need this the most won't read it, but I think having access to it will be incredibly important, and hopefully it will give some validation to what teachers have been saying again and again for years. Not even the last couple, but for years. So I will be very interested, particularly in teacher reception of this. It looks like it's going to follow 3 different educators in 3 kind of different circumstances and be kind of interspersed with other kind of anecdotes from other teachers in different situations and what have you. But hopefully it provides some illumination of the landscape as it currently sits. And then we have Bitter Medicine by Mia Tsai. This follows a young woman who is a descendant of the Chinese god of medicine, and while she was supposed to be a doctor, she is instead an underemployed calligrapher at a fairy temp agency. And this puts her in the realm of half-elf Luke that she has a crush on and is outfitting him with glyphs. He has a curse that he laid on 2 children a long time ago. He is trying to undo. He ends up needing stronger magic from Elle for his next job, which ends up up being capturing Elle's younger brother. So they are both working together, but might have some differing motivations potentially, but we seem to have a kind of fun mix here of like paranormal, but also secret agent mission, spy stuff, and of course romance. And I think that this could be a real breath of fresh air in the paranormal romance space, so I'm excited to see how it's executed. And then continuing my blatant lies in regards to horror, we have Piñata by Leopoldo Gaut. This cover is the most reminiscent of traditional horror and is the most kind of unsettling and disturbing for me. So I kind of debated back and forth about whether I was interested in this, but the themes of this sound so interesting. It involves a woman back in Mexico with her 2 daughters, and she's overseeing the renovation of this cathedral into like a boutique hotel. But after an accident at the construction site, they flee back to New York, and they probably have awakened something. And the blurb talks about how our pasts can haunt us, so I guess we will have to read to find out exactly what past is haunting us here. Then we have Lucha of the Night Forest by Taylor K. Mejia, which if you've been here for a second, the Night Forest is probably all you need to know why I am interested in this. But I'm going to read you the blurb for this one because it is a little bit more sparse, and I think it is a little bit more atmospheric or setting up a kind of atmosphere or feeling. So, an edge-of-your-seat fantasy about a girl who will do anything to protect her sister, even if it means striking a dangerous bargain. Dark forces, forgotten magic, and a heart-stopping queer romance make this young adult novel a must-read. A scorned god, a mysterious acolyte, a forgetting drug, a dangerous forest. One girl caught between the freedom she always wanted and a sister she can't bear to leave behind. Under the cover of the Night Forest, will Lucha be able to step into her own power, or will she be consumed by it? So at the end of the day, that doesn't tell me a whole lot, but I am still appropriately intrigued, and it sets up an expectation for me as a reader that this book is going to be a lot more atmospheric. So we'll just have to see exactly what kind of atmosphere that is and whether it pays off on that. And then we have The London Seance Society by Sarah Penner, author of The Lost Apothecary, which has been incredibly popular, but I admittedly have not read yet. And this follows a woman, Lena, in 1873 coming to Paris to get answers regarding her sister's death, which does make me think of the Fever series a little bit, but this is obviously taking a much different approach, I am sure. And she ends up pairing up with a renowned spiritualist who is in town to solve a high-profile murder. And they end up coming into the orbit of or working with the London Seance Society. However, they begin to suspect that the powerful and elite group of men that make up the society are not only out to solve this murder. So it's got a little bit of everything for everyone, right? It's got the historical bend, it's got like the tinges of the occult, it's got a murder mystery, it's got that kind of exploration of power and who holds it, and the sense of kind of facing off against forces bigger than you. So I think that this will be incredibly popular, especially coming off of the success of The Last Apothecary, and we'll see if it lives up to its predecessor with readers. And then staying in the realm kind of the occult, but really with a supernatural fantasy angle, we have The Witch and the Vampire by Francesca Flores, which oddly enough is billed as a Rapunzel retelling, but it follows 2 young women who are best friends, and they go out one night and one is turned into a vampire, and she has been confined by her mother who has plans to take over this town. But one night this girl Ava escapes into the forest to seek out the vampires for help, but this puts her in the path of Kay, her old friend, who now sees it as her duty to protect the town from vampires. So there is that friends to enemies to lovers arc, there is that forbidden romance, and there is the transitional space of the forest and what those girls have to face there about themselves and about their community and their world. I think I'm interested especially to know how vampires fit in here, because I was intrigued by both the vampire angle and the Rapunzel retelling angle separately, but realizing that they existed together, my brain just kind of put up a big question mark. So I will definitely be interested to see how everything comes together. And I hope that the lore and the world of the vampires here is kind of built up in a substantial enough way to feel the weight of it, because it feels like they're kind of operating in a much different way than I so far really have engaged with vampires in fiction. And I'm always interested in finding new angles and new ways into legends and things that are incredibly popular, so I will just be interested to see how it is executed. And then we have Flux by Jin Woo Chang, which follows 3 kind of protagonists, and it seems to be a kind of sci-fi, time travel, crime noir thriller of sorts. So I'll be interested to see how it plays out. I think it's going to be genre defying and bending, but if anything, I wonder if it will be a kind of like mashup of like The Plotters by Kim Un-soo and Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, which are both very different books, as just kind of like my nearest touchstone. I will say, and I may make some people mad with this, I'm hoping that this will work better for me than dark matter. Now listen, I sold a lot of dark matter when I was a bookseller. I recommended it to a lot of people because I knew a lot of people were going to like that book. But I personally didn't really like that book. It's one of those things where you just know you're not in the audience for the thing, and I haven't read too much Blake Crouch since, but I believe what I've read since I've enjoyed more. I think it was just a mashup of one, it put a bad taste in my mouth early because the wife felt like a plot device and I didn't like that. Two, through no fault of its own, people kept referring to it as a time travel novel when it wasn't. It was exploring like interdimensional stuff. And three, the writing style itself just didn't really work for me. It was a little too choppy, which I know fit within the action forward nature of the book, but sometimes I honestly had trouble picturing things, and at times it felt to me like it really wanted to be a movie and not a book, and so it left me as a reader kind of fumbling sometimes. Again, I know that that choppy, fast-paced prose is what works for a lot of people, so I definitely understand the appeal, it just wasn't for me. So I'm hoping that this will live in a kind of similar world and just work for me personally a little bit better. And then we are finally to March 28th, but don't get too excited just yet because we have a lot of books to talk about. And the first one is from a new to me historical romance author, but has a lot of the tropes I love, or at least one trope that I really love, and that is Yours Truly the Duke by Amelia Gray, and it follows a young woman, Frederica, who needs to get married to retain custody of her late sister's children because another family member, a cousin, is petitioning for custody, and Wyatt, the Duke of Wyatt Haven, which does make me go a little bit like, okay, but he needs to get married to secure an inheritance. So it is a marriage of convenience, and I love, admittedly, a marriage of convenience. So they enter into this marriage with the assumption and the agreement that they will be living completely separate lives, but then, as usual, feelings get involved. So I'll be interested to report back on a new author for me, though not a new author, to be clear, but it has all of the pieces of something I'll love, so high hopes. And then we have Into the Light by Mark Oshiro, which seems to be a queer thriller potential murder mystery that follows two separate protagonists, and I assume that their narratives will converge at some point, and one of our protagonists has been kicked out of his home and is now living in this traveling situation with a specific family, and our other protagonist is living with his family in this isolated community, but he's having trouble remembering his past, and I'm wondering if there are some like cult tinges there, and the discovery of an unidentified body in the hills of California is where these two young men's stories converge. So this is blurbed for fans of Tiffany D. Jackson and Courtney Summers, so I am anticipating some twists and turns for sure. So I anticipate this will be incredibly moving and great for fans of thrillers in the YA space and queer YA. And then we have more fairies with Last Sunrise and Eterna by Amparo Ortiz. This is a kind of return to fairies in the vein of like Wicked Lovely, the Wicked Lovely series by Melissa Marr, or like early 2000s Holly Black, it seems, because it exists in a world where humans can trade away for the right of the exchange, or basically the ability to go experience the magic of the fairy realm for a time. And this is further appealing because of the allure of the elven princes. But our protagonist Sevim has no interest in the fairies, especially after they killed her father, and in fact, to help support her now single mother, she is involved in the black market, kind of trading the bodies of dead elves that turn up. And when one of the elven princes gets wind of this, he forces her to participate in the exchange to get back her captured mother. And in the fairy realm, she is forced to put her trust in this prince who stole her last remaining family member. So there are secrets and there are allegiances, and there's that tinge of the gritty and the darkness that I think will appeal especially to Holly Black fans. So very excited for this one. And then we have Made of Stars by Jenna Voris, which is billed as a kind of young adult queer sci-fi reimagining of Bonnie and Clyde, but it has our Bonnie and Clyde characters facing off against a recent flight school graduate, and he's forced to kind of pick a side while both kind of coming up against this really compelling duo and realizing that a lot of what he considered truth may be more complicated. So definitely always looking for some fun sci-fi in the YA space or generally, and I think that this will be a fun romp, even as someone who's not particularly drawn to the Bonnie and Clyde story inherently. So I'll be interested to see what this spin is. And then we have Lone Women by Victor Lavelle, which is inevitably going to be the exception to my I don't like westerns rule. It's set in 1914 and it follows Adelaide, who is fleeing to Montana, running from the secret sin that she killed her parents. And on this journey, she is always dragging her locked steamer trunk. And the trunk is always locked because when she opens it, people around her disappear. But in Montana, she isn't as alone as she thinks she she is. So another book that's kind of testing that line of horror with me, but here we're seemingly going to be exploring what's scary in the vastness, presumably with lots of other things, including what exactly is going on in that trunk. So I think that this is going to be a really unique look and exploration of running from our pasts and reinvention, and I'm also so compelled by the imagery and the metaphor of that locked steamer trunk, which I think is just an excellent initial image to capture you. And to keep along the horror adjacent lines for a second, A House with Good Bones by T. Kingfisher. This is being promoted as a Southern Gothic, but what really stood out to me in the blurb is it's following this protagonist going home to be with her mother and anticipating kind of languid nights on the couch with her mom, drinking boxed wine and watching murder documentaries. But when she gets home, the kind of cluttered, homey space she anticipated has been kind of cleared out, the walls are painted white, and it feels very sterile, and she immediately knows that something is wrong. And I found this really interesting because especially when houses are our unsettling kind of atmosphere or setting, we tend to have kind of older environs or this sense that the layout of the house doesn't exactly make sense, it feels cluttered, there's a sense that our protagonists feel trapped in some ways, and here it seems we may be looking at kind of the opposite of that. Additionally, our protagonist starts just finding oddities and things that aren't normal. Like, for instance, she finds a jar of teeth amidst the rose bushes, and so she has to get to the heart of what is going on here and what secrets this house may hold. And then continuing our slide down that spectrum of like full horror to the kind of weird and odd, we have the highly anticipated new short story collection from Kelly Link, White Cat, Black Dog. I believe this is her first collection since Get in Trouble, and I am so excited. If you like kind of Karen Russell type stories, stories that live in the oddities of things, these are your stories. Kelly Link, and I think Get in Trouble in particular, were really one of the first short story collections I fell in love with, and I've always kind of gravitated back to short stories that live and play in this kind of oddness. And in terms of other things I love, it seems like this collection is really going to be pulling from fairy tales and folklore. For instance, one of the stories kind of teased out in the blurb seems to kind of come from the same root as King Lear. I'll be interested to see how many of these stories I can trace back to a parent story, but ultimately I am just so excited to get to play in these weird worlds again and am incredibly excited for this. And then we have the newest from Marie Lu, Stars and Smoke, which follows an international pop star and a spy, and the international pop star who gets caught up in this kind of covert operation. It seems like it's going to be the most contemporary or like reality adjacent that I've seen from Lu, but even with that we have these kind of heightened elements, both with the pop star angle and with the spies angle. That being said, there is still a fantasy tag on the book, so I will be interested to see if that is in fact true, or if it's just kind of pulling from the spaces Lu has played in narratively before. But I think that this will be a lot of fun because generally Lu's books are a lot of fun, though I'm admittedly not caught up on all of her books, but definitely one I will keep on my radar and maybe bump up on the list of Lu's work. And then we have The Scandalous Ladies of London, The Countess by Sophie Jordan, which is the start of a new series. And I'm going to be honest with you, I am both intrigued and hesitant on this one. If you've been with me for a second, I've read Sophie Jordan in the past, both her romance, which I've talked about here, and I read her young adult back in the day as well. And I've had some issues with the pacing in her books. They often move just a little too quick for me. But I'm also intrigued by this new series, especially as it feels like it has a tinge of the Sarah McLean, especially the most recent series. I'm not blown away by the naming of this admittedly, but it seems to follow a Countess, Lady Gertrude, as she is kind of launching her daughter on the marriage mart scene, and her daughter kind of captures the attention of a suitor, Jasper, until it becomes clear that Jasper is much more interested in True and kind of their affair and Jasper's desire to make that affair permanent and what that would mean and if anyone ever found out. So Scandalous does seem to be appropriate here, and I will be interested to see how it plays out. The page length is listed a little longer here, so I am hoping that that may solve some of my pacing problems. Hopefully it will allow the narrative to spread itself out and build itself out a little bit more than just packing unrooted action into things, but we'll see. I'm gonna hope for the best because I think it sounds like an interesting premise and I really want it to land. So as usual, we'll see what we get. And then moving back into the realm of the Fae, this time with a sprinkle of what seems to be Stardust energy, we have The Fairy Bargains of Prospect Hill by Rowena Miller. This follows two sisters, and one has entered a marriage and learns that her husband is not what she thought And so her sister is trying to help her escape this marriage, and they are making small fairy bargains to try and buy time. It also seems like the realm of the Fae in this is really going to be contrasted against the modernization and the Industrial Revolution, and so we're definitely going to be looking at this world on the cusp of change in a lot of different ways, but these small bargains can only buy time for so long, and eventually a much larger bargain or deal is needed, and the price may be more than they are willing to pay. So this doesn't necessarily seem like it's going to be full cozy, especially with some of the themes it's exploring, but in terms of some of the books that are living in the fairy realm or towing right up against it this month, I think this may be the closest to that side of the spectrum, and definitely one I am interested in visiting. And I'm getting my Stardust parallels because the blurb talks about the realm of the Fae being on just the other side of the veil. So hopefully the narrative will let us travel to that side of the veil as well. And then finally, Chlorine by Jade Song, which seems like it is going to be a kind of twisted mashup of the Pisces and the 13th year, which follows a young swimmer who really wants to be a mermaid. And according to the blurb, which I'm going to read from verbatim, it explores the trials and tribulations of growing up in a society that puts pressure on young women and their bodies, a powerful, relevant novel of immigration, sapphic longing, and fierce, defiant becoming. And I think we could all use a little fierce and defiant becoming, especially right now. We did it. It's been a hot second on this side of the camera. Who knows what it'll end up being for you, but thank you for hanging in there with me the whole way if you were still here. We've talked about a good amount of titles today, but that being said, as always, I will have left some out. So let me know what you're excited about, whether we've talked about it today or not. Thanks for hanging out and listening to what I'm excited about. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah, bye.